Hakol lifnei haShabbos. The second thing that the Shulchan Aruch says is that you have to dispose of all of your chametz before Shabbos. Okay, u'meshayrin mazon shtei seudos litzarach haShabbos, and you have to leave over whatever chametz you need to have 2 meals on Shabbos. That's what you should leave over as far as chametz. In other words, you check for chametz, you get rid of all your chametz, and just leave over whatever you need for the Shabbos meals, whatever chametz you need for the Shabbos meals, and you're going to have to set that aside in a segregated area. Okay, so that's the basic halacha. The seuda shlishis zmana achar hamincha, va'az eino yachol la'asosa. He says, why not set aside enough chametz for the 3 meals? He says, because the 3rd meal is going to have to be done after mincha, and you're not allowed to have chametz at that time. We know that you're not allowed to have chametz after chatzos. So besides the issue of entering Pesach with a hearty appetite, you also are precluded from eating anything that's chametz after chatzos, which is the proper time for Suda Shlishit. And at that time, therefore, you cannot have your meal of shalashudas with either bread or with matzah, because as we'll learn, you're not allowed to eat matzah on Erev Pesach as well. Ella b'matzah ashira, and therefore the only option is to have matzah ashira, which is literally enriched matzah. What is it enriched with? It's enriched with mei perot. That's usually the way the Gemara understands it, with fruit juices. V'tzarach la'asota kodem sha'a asirit. And finally, you have to start shalashudas before the 10th hour, the beginning of the 10th hour or the end of the 9th hour, just like the Mishnah had said. Now, that's the psak of the Mechaber. However, comes along the Ramah, and he says, "Uvamadinos elu she'ein nohagin lechol matzah ashira." In our countries, we do not have a minhag of eating matzah ashira, as we'll learn later on in Siman Tov Samach Beis. And therefore, Yekayim Suda Shlishit b'minei perot o basar v'dagim. And therefore, you should have shalashudas with something that's not hamotzi, so you can use either fruit or with meat or fish. As we learned before in Hilchos Shabbos, that technically a person could fulfill the mitzvah of shalashudas if they don't have bread available. They could still fulfill it with things other than bread. The poskim say that it's not a lichatchila to have shalashudas without bread, but if there's a compelling reason why bread cannot be eaten, such as there is on Erev Pesach, you can use food items other than bread, other than matzah, other than hamotzi. Now, it's quite curious that the Ramah speaks out of order, because normally the psak is that if you have a choice between having meat or fish or peiros or fruit, you should have meat or fish. It's considered to be more chashuv. So why does he say b'minei peiros o basar v'dagim? This is a question that the poskim ask. He should have said either basar v'dagim o minei peiros. Choose the more preferable one first. This is a question that the poskim discuss. We're not going to focus on that tonight. Now, we'll just look at the Mishnah Brura very briefly, just to see how the Mishnah Brura understands what's going on. He says, I'm going to choose select Mishnah Bruras. So he explains in Sifkat and Beis, Leil Yud Gimel, you have to check the night of the 13th, the Thursday night before Pesach. L'machar be'erev Shabbos efshar livdok de'ein botikin la'oracham ha'uchanal. You can't check any later than Thursday night, because the following day will be Friday, and even though it's not, you would have argued check as close to Erev Pesach as possible. You can't do that because you can only check by the light of a flame at night and not by the light of the sun. U'mishayirin, and you leave over food chametz that you'll need for the 2 Shabbos meals that you're allowed to have chametz. And he says, "V'tzarach lizahir lahanicho b'makom mutzna." Be careful to make sure that it's in a hidden place. The worst thing that would be is if you hid your or if you put aside your chametz bread for your challahs for Shabbos, and then someone attacked them and went into them, and the baby went ahead and messed up the house with that. Okay, so comes along in Sifkat and Dalid, Litzorach HaShabbos, for the needs of Shabbos, Uv'Shabbos zeh mashkimim lihitpalel. On that Shabbos that falls out on Erev Pesach, you wake up early to daven, V'lo ya'arichu harbe kedei sheyeh lehem shahut. Do not lengthen the davening on that Shabbos morning. No chazanas, no protracted tefillos, kedei sheyeh lahem shahut, so that people will have time to engage in their Shabbos meal while it's still within the allotted time when you're allowed to have chametz. And we know that after the 4th hour, after the 3rd hour, you're no longer allowed to have chametz. So you have to make sure that all of your chametz is eaten by, it'll be 10:30 in the morning, okay? And therefore you won't come, until the beginning of the 4th hour. So is that right? So is it till the beginning of the 5th hour? Till the beginning of the 5th hour. The end of the 4th hour is the zman you're allowed to have chametz. And so you have to make sure you finish davening in plenty of time, so that you'll be able to consume your Shabbos meal with chametz. Now, that's why I mentioned after Mincha today, here at the shul, we're only going to be having 2 minyanim that Shabbos morning. One will be a Netz minyan at 6:10 a.m. Ouch. Okay, so I guess you won't be going to that one. And the other one will be, unless you go to bed really early, in which case, maybe you will make it. And the other one will be at 7:30. That's for the loafers, the men of leisure. You'll be davening at 7:30 a.m. on Erev Pesach. Okay, and then right afterwards, you'll have the meal. Okay, so, and then he points out you're not allowed to use either matzah or chametz for shalosh shudas. Deha'asr lechol matzah be'erev Pesach. You're not allowed to eat matzah on Erev Pesach. Now, one of the things we want to see is this isser of achilas matzah on Erev Pesach, is it only after chatzos, or is it before chatzos as well? So therefore, the Mechaber had said our minhag is to use matzah ashira, hainu shenilo shebimei perot levad, which means that it's been kneaded only with fruit juices, without water. And you have to make sure that you have your shalosh shudas meal kodem sha'a asiris, before the beginning of the 10th hour. Demisham va'elach afilu matzah ashira aser lechol, kedei sheyochol matzah l'te'avon. Because even matzah ashira you can't eat past that time, so that you should be able to go into your seder with a hearty appetite. And therefore, you should fulfill shalosh shudas with fruit or meat or fish. And so he just reviews for us, and he points out that we learned in Hilchos Shabbos that the b'shas hadechak kazeh, that in a shas hadechak, in a dire situation where there's really very little other option, you can be somech al hamikilim. Va'ayin sham diyoser tov bebasar v'dagim mi ba'peros. And the Mishnah Berurah makes a point of saying that if you have an option between basar v'dagim or peros, basar v'dagim is the preferred food because it's more chashuv. V'hu hadin diyachol l'kayim b'tabshel k'gon k'nedelach. He says, and there are those who say that you could fulfill it with cooked food that's made from the 5 grains, such as matzah balls. He says, but in that respect, there's a difference between having shalosh shudas from matzah balls and shalosh shudas from gefilte fish, because the shalosh shudas that you have from matzah balls has to be finished before the beginning of the 10th hour. Okay? And again, it has to do with the fact that you're not allowed to eat any food that's going to be filling past the beginning of the 10th hour. Meat and fish and fruit is considered to be non-filling, but Kanedalach is considered to be filling. An interesting thing that just came to my mind is that you might need to be careful if the gefilte fish is made with matzah meal. That if you want to have it after the beginning of the 10th hour, you'd have to make sure that it's a non-gebrachs kind of gefilte fish. I'm not sure if that's how we would paskin, because maybe it's only ledabek ba'alma, maybe it's only there to cause the fish to adhere well, but it could be something to think about. Okay. And again, the Mishnah Berurah says, even if you're going to be using fish or meat, make sure you only have a little bit. Don't fill yourself up with those things so that you'll have a hearty appetite for the Seder. Sva'ayin b'achronim shekasvu, the tov gam kain sheyachalek suda shachar shel pas l'shnayim. Now the achronim also paskin, and this is the Mishnah Berurah quoting, I believe, from the Magen Avram and from others, that it is preferred to have 2 morning meals. In other words, your Shabbos morning meal divided into 2 parts. Hainu, that what does that mean? Daha yesh omrim diyotze bazeh yidei suda gimel. Because some say that you fulfill shalosh shudas even if you eat it earlier in the day. Even if you eat it earlier in the day. As a matter of fact, in certain communities in Israel, that's what they do all the time, is that they'll have what we would call shalosh shudas, they call that lunch. And a lot of times it's even before chatzos hayom. Yeah. Yeah. So he says, V'chein kasav bevir hagra denachon lasos kain. And the Vilna Gaon says it's preferable to do that because that way you're getting in your shalosh shudas with bread or with hamotzi item. Ach kol zeh im yesh lo shahus levarach bintayim ulahapsik eza shahus kedei shlo yeh bechlal bracha she'eina tzricha. However, you have to be careful because there's another consideration. What if I artificially separate one meal into 2 meals so that basically what I say, okay, Ad Kan Seuda, this is the second Seuda of Shabbos. Now let's bench. And now, okay, and then we sing Shir Amalos and we bench with a mezumin, whatever it is. And then 5 seconds later, after we finish benching, I said, okay, let's all go wash. So the Mishnah Berurah says that's not correct because you're causing what's called a bracha she'eina tzricha. You're causing an unnecessary bracha to be recited because if you know in advance that immediately after you bench, you're going to wash again, so the benching is not a real benching. It's not a grace after meals because it's anticipation of another meal right afterwards. And the hamotzi is also like a bracha she'eina tzricha, close to being a bracha levatala, a wasteful bracha. And that's halachically incorrect also. So therefore, what the poskim say is you should finish your second meal, take a little walk, a little spatzir on Shabbos morning. So let's say you sit down for your meal at 9 a.m., because davening will go lickety-split. Everything's going to go very fast. You'll start at 7:30. You'll finish your davening at 9. You'll run to the meal. You'll sit down. You'll make kiddush and hamotzi. You'll be done by, 9:20, 9:30. You'll say, okay, everyone, we're going to take a walk. It's a beautiful Toronto spring day. We don't even need coats, halavai. We're going to go for a walk. Everyone come back in half an hour. So by then, already since you've changed places and you've put significant space of time and place between yourself and the first morning meal, then you could justifiably wash, have your bread again before the sof zman of achilas chametz, which is at 10:30, and that way you could bench again. So that's what is advocated by the Vilna Gaon, and that's how the Mishnah Berurah paskins. Okay, so that's the standard practice. That's what I did for years until I discovered something that we'll talk about hopefully later on.
Egg matzah both times. Egg matzah at 9.
Mishnah Berurah doesn't mention egg matzah at all. The only one who mentions egg matzah is the Mechaber. Okay. The Ramah says we don't do egg matzah anymore. And therefore, the Mishnah Berurah is only talking about bread, which you have to get in until Sof Zman Achilas Chametz.
Well, you don't want bread in the house.
Okay, so what do we do? So first of all, as you know, Shloimi, from 3 years ago, and the previous time before then, was someone told me 2008, although I don't remember exactly. And then the next one after this one is going to be in 20 years from now. Okay, so it's not a common occurrence. So you won't, in 20 years from now, halavai, we should all be alive and well. You won't remember this shiur, but you can certainly chazer the notes. The question is, where does the idea of egg matzah come from? Where is it from? Especially if the Ramah makes an explicit statement of saying, Uve medinos elu, in our countries, we don't do egg matzah. So what does he mean by that? Is there a problem with doing egg matzah? So, and remember, the Mechaber was advocating using egg matzah until the beginning of the 10th hour. So you shouldn't have to rush and do a second meal before the Sof Zman of Achilas Chametz. If you're going to use egg matzah, you can have your egg matzah meal at 4 p.m. and it should be fine. Okay? So we don't do that. We do egg matzah in the morning, and we don't do any matzah or bread after the Sof Zman of Achilas Chametz. So where does that all come from? So the first thing that we have to keep in mind is that the way the Aruch HaShulchan understands the Ramah's declarative that we do not do matzah ashira in our medinos is not saying that it's usher to use matzah ashira. Take a look at what he says. Because of Rabbeinu Harama, source number 5, he says, Uve medinos elu she'ei noagim lechol matzah ashira k'delakam in siman taf samach beis yikaim suda shlishis b'minei peros o bebasar v'dagim. He says, since we don't use matzah ashira, you should instead have shalashudis with fruit or with fish or with meat. V'nir'eh she'ein hakavana degam be'erev Pesach ein lechol matzah ashir lefi aminag. He says, that doesn't mean that it's usher to have matzah ashira on Erev Pesach. De'ein shum tam bazeh. There's no reason to prohibit it. Why do we not eat matzah on Erev Pesach? Because you want the flavor of matzah to be something novel. It should be exciting and new, right? The same idea as eating it l'te'avam. And we're going to see the Gemara give a very stark metaphor for the idea of anyone who eats matzah on Erev Pesach. He says, Ela hakavana, keven she'ein min hagenu lechol bepesach matzah ashira, memela de'ein mechinen etzleinu matzah ashira. He says, the reason is because people in our circles simply don't have such a minhag. Even when Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, that never was the minhag by us to prepare a special type of matzah called matzah ashira. It's just not something that is part of our cultural custom. In other words, in Sephardic lands, I guess they would make matzah ashira all the time. But Ashkenazim, where Kalta Litvaks, and we don't like to have anything that's pleasant in our lives. So it's either it's flour or water or it's nothing, right? So we don't have matzah ashira, right? So if that's the case, memela de'ein mechinen etzleinu matzah ashira. He says, and therefore it's not something that's prevalent in our communities. Ulahachin rak al seuda shlishis ein derech b'nei adam lahatriach al ma'achal katan kazeh. He says, and it's not therefore expected for people to prepare, especially for shalashudis when Erev Pesach falls out on Shabbos, to prepare egg matzah or what's called matzah ashira. Now, of course, that reason no longer applies because all I have to do is go to Olive Branch, where they have a whole separate store for Pesach. I actually told Justin, I said, Justin, this year you're going to have to double or triple your egg matzah orders because it's a special configuration this year. He had no idea what I was talking about, but he said, he made a note of it and he said, we're going to have to order more egg matzah. He says, because there's going to be a run on egg matzah. And that now that you're seeing we're part of this shiur, you should tomorrow go and buy egg matzah because I guarantee you that it's going to be sold out in most of the stores the closer we get to Pesach, because people are going to only realize much later that, hey, I better use egg matzah instead of challah. Now, there are going to be some people who are not going to have a problem using actual chametz and Erev Pesach, which is also fine. That's actually arguably even better, according to some opinions. However, he says, and therefore he says, "V'hinei gam etzleinu yecholim lasos suda shlishis b'matzah mevusheles, v'harbe nogim etzleinu kein." He says a lot of people use boiled foods that are made with matzah, like kinedalach, and that's perfectly fine even after the sof zman of achilas chametz. V'hiktim minei peros lebasar v'dagim afagav the basar v'dagim adifa mi peros le'inin suda shlishis mikol makom be'erev Pesach peros adifi kidei shelo yispa v'yochel matzah l'te'avon. And so the Aruch HaShulchan answers the question that we asked before. Why does the Ramah put fruit first and then fish and meat second? He says the answer is because normally fish and meat are preferable to fruit if you have your option of what to eat for Shalosh Shudas. However, on Erev Pesach, you want to minimize those foods that are filling, and therefore dafka on Erev Pesach that falls out on Shabbos, if you have a choice of having an apple versus having a piece of fish or a piece of meat, you're much better off having the apple, right? So that you'll stay hungry. Okay, Ad Kan, our halacha in Shulchan Aruch in Siman Taf Mem Dal. Now we have a little bit of a better understanding. When the Ramah says we don't use matzah ashira, he's not saying you cannot use matzah ashira. It's just not our minhag, and therefore you can use other foods. Okay, but we also learned from the Mishnah Berurah that there's a minhag to divide that Shabbos morning meal into 2 meals whenever feasible. Okay, let us go on. Let's take a look at the Talmud Yerushalmi. Amar Rebbe Levi, ha'ochel matzah be'erev ha'pesach keba al arusaso beveis chamiv. That if a person eats matzah on Erev Pesach, it's if he had relations with his fiancée while she is still living with her parents. In other words, you're going to consummate the marriage imminently, but you can't hold yourself back. And so you have a surreptitious, a covert relationship with her before. And meaning that this is considered to be immoral in some way or unethical in some way. And and as we know that if you do so, you get malchus. You are given lashes because you've done something sinful. In a similar vein, if you eat matzah on Erev Pesach, you have done something sinful by encountering your beloved mitzvah, and you're eating it before the mitzvah has arrived. Right? So that's the analogy. Now, of course, this is going to be a fascinating discussion in the Tshuva, in the Igros Moshe, as what this analogy actually means. So then we have another opinion of Tani Reb Yehuda ben Beseira Omer, Bein Chametz, Bein Matzah Aser. Not only are you not allowed to have matzah on Erev Pesach, you're not allowed to have chametz on Erev Pesach. And by the way, the Chachamim disagree with that, and they permit you to have chametz until Chatzos Hayom or until the Sof Zman Achilas chametz. And Rabbi Simon b'Shem Rabbi Shua ben Levi Rabbi lo hayochel lo chametz v'lo matzah, and they say that was Rabbi's minhag, that on Erev Pesach he did not eat either chametz or matzah. Lo matzah min hada de Rabbi Levi, v'lo chametz min hada de Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. He did not eat matzah because of Rabbi Levi's halacha, that's kabo al arusaso beveis chamiv, and he did not eat chametz because of the concern of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira. Now, Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira has not provided a reason as to why you can't have chametz. Now, the Korban Ha'eda suggests, he says, chametz mishum dichsiv, he says it's based on a pasuk. The Torah says, lo sishchat al chametz dam zivchi. The Torah says, you may not slaughter with chametz the blood of my offering. Now, he says, lo sishchat ha'pesach va'adayin chametz kayim. So basically what that means is that you're not allowed to offer the Korban Pesach while you still own chametz. And therefore, umachshir haya ben Beseira bepesach sheshachtu shacharis. Ben Beseira had a unique shita that you're allowed to, technically, if you bring the Korban Pesach anytime on Erev Pesach, even if it's in the morning, you're yotzei the mitzvah. So since according to Ben Beseira, you could offer the Korban Pesach the entire day of Erev Pesach, you cannot have chametz the entire day. However, according to the Chachamim, you can only a korban Pesach that's offered on Erev Pesach before Chatzos is not valid, and therefore you would be allowed to have chametz up until either midday or an hour before midday, which is when you have to get rid of or 2 hours before, depending upon the shita. Okay, you now have the information that you need, the sort of the background information that you need in order for us to do this tshuva from Rav Moshe. So comes along Rav Moshe, and he says, this is Moshe, Rav Moshe wrote this tshuva early on. It's in the first chelek of Orach Chaim, the first volume of Igros Moshe. The Inyan, this is page 2, source number 8. The Inyan Isser Achilas Matzah Be'erev Pesach. He says, as far as eating matzah on Erev Pesach, ve'ech yasu elu she'ein rotzim lahashir chametz l'shtei asudas d'Shabbos shechal be'erev Pesach. And what people who do not wish to leave over chametz in their houses on Erev Pesach that falls out on Shabbos, you've already switched over completely. Everything is Pesachdik. Your wife is going to have a nervous attack if you have any chametz that's there out in the open. And so you'd like to avoid any tension, any kind of anyone being brought to the psychiatric ward over Yontif. So you want to be able to have a peaceful Yontif. So you want to be able to avoid having chametz in your house that Shabbos. So what should you do? So he writes this in Tafshin Yud Daled, which is 1954. Ma'asherot sekvot taraso leida daiti haklusha bedavar ichyasu elu she'ein ritzonam. Lahashir chametz l'sudas hashabbos shechal shanazu be'erev haPesach b'chiyuv hapas v'lechem mishnah shetzrichim l'shtei sudos. On the one hand, you don't want to have chametz in the house. On the other hand, you need to have bread for the first 2 meals at the very minimum. Avar mitechila etzem isur matzah be'erev Pesach shepligi harishon bizman ha'isur umemela yisboyer gam l'maisa. So first of all, we need to explain what the isur of eating matzah is on Erev Pesach. That's where I would like to start off. Hine rabosenu harishonim pligi im isur matzah hu kol hayom de Erev Pesach, or rak mizman isur chametz. When is it usur to eat matzah on Erev Pesach? Is it usur the entire day, or is it usur only from the time that chametz becomes usur? Once chametz is usur, according to that second opinion, you also are not allowed to eat matzah. Shadas bal hamachaber v'harosh b'psachim shuhurak mizman isur chametz. That it's only, according to these opinions, it's only usur from chatzos and onwards. When chametz is usur, then matzah is also usur. The Ramban sober sham shuhu usur b'chol hayom. And the Ramban disagrees. He holds that matzah is usur for the entire day. Correct. Some people have a 30-day minhag, and some people have a 2-week minhag. We will get there in just a second. But you see, even Erev Pesach itself, there's a machlokus in the Rishonim, whether it's for the entire Erev Pesach or only from the Zman Isser Chametz and onwards.
When he says Kol Yom, it's the night before.
Correct. Yeah. Presumably. Although he does, okay, but it's not really halacha l'maisa.
Well, that's a big deal because it covers the first suit.
Correct. V'hanachon lanias daiti, the mashma bi pashtus lashon haYerushalmi she Rabbi Levi v'Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira pligi be'isser achilas matzah imhu talui be'isser achilas chametz. It seems to me that when we go back to the Yerushalmi, it would seem that the machlokas between Rabbi Levi and Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, because remember, Rabbi Levi only says you cannot eat matzah, but because it's like kibol arusaso v'veis chametz. But according to Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, you are forbidden from eating both matzah and chametz. He says, it seems to me that this is the machlokas. The Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira sover shetolui be'isser achilas chametz. He says, it seems that Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira says that just like you can't have matzah on Erev Pesach, you also can't have chametz. Shaharetani Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira omer bein chametz bein matzah aser. V'lachein. And therefore, even though according to him, it's usher the entire day, but according to the Chachamim who say that's directly linked to the Korban Pesach, and according to the Chachamim, the Korban Pesach can only be offered after Chatzos. Therefore, the Isser Chametz is only after Chatzos, and therefore the Isser Matzah is also only after Chatzos. The Imken, I'm just skipping a couple lines. Aliba de Rabbanan sheposlim bepesach shachto shacharis, shelachen lo itzer bechametz ela mechatzos, gam b'matzah lo itzer ela mechatzos. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira argues Rav Moshe is linking matzah and chametz together. Whenever chametz is aser, matzah becomes aser as well. And according to the Chachamim, that's only from chatzos and onwards. Avol Rabbi Levi sover she'ein taloi iser achilas matzah be'iser achilas chametz, ela af l'Rabbanan she'isur chametz u'mechatzos nami iser aser b'matzah kol hayom. However, Rabbi Levi offers a distinctive reason. Rabbi Levi's reason is kibol arusaso beveis chametz, and therefore it's got nothing to do with the pasuk of lo sishchat al chametz dam zivchi. It's got nothing to do with linking it to chametz, but rather it's got to do with a moral imperative that you should not engage in indulging your desire for matzah before the mitzvah arrives. So if that's the case, then it's usher the entire day, the entire Erev Pesach, not just during the time that chametz is usher. And I'm skipping a whole bunch of material here, but let's go. He says, "V'hanachon lani es daiti shepligi betam da asru arusasa." He says, it seems to me that Rabbi Levi and Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira both agree that the inappropriateness of eating matzah on Erev Pesach is linked to boel arusaso beveis chametz. But why is it usher? Why do you get lashes if you have sexual relations with your fiance before the wedding? He says, Imhu mishum da adayin ena kinuya lo legamre, hechshivu lo legabe kekodem hakidushin shaya aser ba beiser penuya. One reason could be is that the rabbi said that even though this woman is betrothed to you, but she's not yet your full-fledged wife to the point where you could be intimate with her physically. That's one reason. And that's why you get lashes if you consummate with her, because you're jumping the gun. She's not your full-fledged wife yet. But there's another possibility, says Rav Moshe. O dekevan shebe'erusin ein alav adayin chiyuv ona, va'achar hanisuin hayihye alav ba'chiyuv ona, asru rabbanan lahaschil bevias rishus. Listen to the svara of Rav Moshe. He says as follows. Maybe she is your full-fledged wife after Erusin. However, one thing we know about the difference between Erusin and Nisuin. Once my wife is living in my household, I have a mitzvah obligation of what we call conjugal duty. I have a conjugal duty to satisfy my wife physically. And when a person embarks on that, what would you call it, a career of conjugal duty, he should only have relations, the first time he has relations with his wife is only when he has a mitzvah of ona. Don't start off on the wrong foot having relations with your wife before you have a mitzvah of ona. The first time you consummate should be when there's an obligation to be with your wife, so that you fulfill a mitzvah. Like the Chachamim were basically saying, why be with your wife before there's a mitzvah to be with her? The first time you should be with her is when you're commanded to be with her. And that only starts after Nisuin. It's not that it's usher to be with her, but if you are with her before the Nisuin, you're not doing a mitzvah. But only when you've had Nisuin with her, where there's actually a mitzvah to be with her, that's when we want you to start your physical intimacy with your wife. Do you hear the difference between the two? The first way of looking at it is you're doing an isser by having relations with a woman who's you're not fully married to, because it's only after Erusin and it's not after Nisun. That's one way of looking at it, and therefore you get lashes. Another way of looking at it is what you're doing is unethical and you deserves lashes, not because she's not your wife, but because you don't yet have a mitzvah of being physically intimate with her. What? No, it's not. It's not. It's mutter, but there's no mitzvah. It's not that it's mahuder to wait. The rabbi said, you're engaging in a very intimate relationship with your wife. Don't begin that on the wrong foot. Begin it at a time when you're doing a mitzvah in that process. Don't do it just because it's permissible. Do it when there's only a mitzvah. He says, "Da'af sha'achar hanisuin hitir af shelo bizman ona shehu rishus mikol makom asur lahaschil bios ishto bevia sheina shel mitzvah." Rav Moshe's argument is, once you're married, you can have relations as often as you like, even beyond the time of ona. Because ona for a Talmud Chacham is, let's say, once a week. Let's say I want to be with my wife twice a week, or 3 times a week, or 4 times a week. Perfectly fine. And I'm not doing a mitzvah necessarily during those additional times that I'm intimate with her, but that's okay. When you start that career of ona, however, the first time has to be a mitzvah. That's Rav Moshe's argument, that's the machlokas. So now, why does he say these are the 2 ways of looking at it? He says, V'hinei latam rishon shu mitzad iser penuya, ein shaykh klal dimyon matzah be'erev Pesach le'iser arusa bebeis chamev. He says, if you look at it the first way, then it's very puzzling how Rabbi Levi can compare eating matzah on Erev Pesach to having relations with your fiance. Having relations with your fiance is asur, because she's not your wife yet. So how does that compare with eating matzah on Erev Pesach? He says, matzah. He says, there's no mitzvah of eating matzah the entire year. We even say it in Manishtana. So there's no mitzvah of eating matzah the rest of the year. So what are you going to tell me? Just like I'm not allowed to have relations with my wife during the time when it's not the mitzvah of ona, I can't eat matzah the rest of the year. I have to wait until Dafka Pesach. That doesn't make any sense. Doesn't make any sense if you look at it that way. This is the first explanation. If she's not my fully fledged wife, and therefore it's usher to be intimate with her, how do you compare that to eating matzah? What isser is there of eating matzah when it's not Pesach? It's not like it's chazer, it's not like it's treif, right?
Eating matzah Erev Pesach is not us.
Well, that's the argument that he's making is that it shouldn't be, it is usher, but the question is, why is it usher? It's not comparable to being boil arusaso if being boil arusaso is because she's not fully your wife, so she's usher to you. That doesn't make any sense. How do you compare that to matzah? So he says, according to the second reason, it makes much more sense. He says, so according to the first reason, we'd have to say, De'en hakavana l'dimyon u'lemashal, ela shehu le'inyan hametzius. He says it's not really a perfect analogy. Like Chazal say that if you eat matzah on Erev Pesach, it's like bol arusasu b'veis chama. It's not really a perfect analogy. Shenimtza sha'af shekvar yeshalav dinei Pesach b'miktzas, asur b'matzah shelo ki b'yimei ha'Pesach mamish, shekein hu gam ba'arusa sha'af shekvar yeshalav dinei ishus asur l'bayla. The only analogy, it's a very loose analogy because it's really not comparable at all, but the analogy is as follows, that while during the time that I'm not allowed to eat chametz, I'm also not allowed to eat matzah. So because it's during a time when it's not yet Pesach, but there's still a miktsas, there's still a partial isser upon me. It's partially Pesach and it's partially not Pesach. So for that reason, because I'm not allowed to eat chametz, I'm also not allowed to eat matzah. That was the argument that we said according to the one side of the argument as to why you can't eat matzah on Erev Pesach. He says it's very loosely comparable to arusasa. She's partially my wife, she's partially not my wife, and therefore better that I should wait until she's fully my wife before I consummate the marriage. So it's only comparable in that sense, that on Erev Pesach, after Chatzos, it's partially Pesach, it's partially not Pesach, so therefore wait until it's fully Pesach. But it's not a perfect analogy, because if anything, it's just the opposite. because during the rest of the year, I can eat matzah to my heart's delight. It's only on Erev Pesach where I have this restriction because it's partially Pesach, partially not Pesach. So it's totally a different animal, but it's a very loose connection. He says, so anyway, he says, but I'm just skipping. And that's the reason why, according to the one opinion, the Isser of matzah would only be after chatzos. Not because it's like Kabol Arusasu Beveis Chamiv exactly, but it's loosely comparable to it. Avolatam habeis sheha Isser barusa hu dafka machmas shekvar kinuyalo. He says, but if you look at it according to the second reason, that she's fully fledged your wife, right? The dafka machmas shekvar kinuyalo asru kodem shenasal of chiyuv mitzvah saona, but that you shouldn't indulge yourself with your wife before you have a mitzvah of ona, of mitzvah of being intimate with her. Hu mamish iser matzah be'erev Pesach inyan echad v'dimin mamish la'arusa. He says that's perfectly comparable to eating matzah on Erev Pesach. It's available to you, but you don't have a mitzvah yet to eat it, and therefore wait until you have the mitzvah. He says ulamasha bi'arti, based on what I've written. I'm skipping to the next paragraph. Yesh makom lama shenagu harbe she'ein ochle matzah mirosh chodes Nisan. Then we can understand why so many people have this minhag not to eat matzah from Rosh Chodesh. Let's see, what's Shabbos Yair? I'm not sure what that abbreviation is. Simin Taf Ayin Aleph Sivkat and Zayin Mishar Knesses Hagdola. Dekaven Dilatam Beishem Itam Za'asru Kol Hayom Hayishayich Be'etzem Lesser Od Mishloshim Yom Kodem L'Rabbanim Shei Shabbos L'Pshim Gamliel. He says, because why do people refrain 2 weeks before or 30 days before? Because that's when we're starting to learn about Hilchos Pesach. Because there's a machlokis in the Gemara, when are we obligated to start darshaning about Hilchos Pesach? According to the Chachamim, it's 30 days before Pesach. And according to Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, it's 2 weeks before Pesach. So once you're already starting to learn about the mitzvah, it's as if it's a time of when she's your arusa. She's on your mind. You're very attracted to her. You want to be able to consummate, but you have to wait until you actually have a mitzvah of ona, or a mitzvah of achilas matzah. And that's why people refrain from eating matzah once they start learning about it and getting excited about it, okay? Now, the next part of the tshuva is all about the viability of eating egg matzah as far as being able to be koveya suda on egg matzah. We know that the Sfardim may have an issue with this. Sfardim generally do not use egg matzah because they generally are more liberal as far as what is called pas haba b'kisnin and what warrants saying hamotzi on pas haba b'kisnin. What I mean by that is egg matzah is clearly pas haba b'kisnin. It is not normally hamotzi. If you were to eat egg matzah as a snack, you would make a mazonos. However, when you're koveya su'uda on pas haba b'kisnin, the psak of the Ashkenazi poskim is that you make hamotzi just by using it in the same way that you would use bread. And therefore, it warrants hamotzi and it warrants birkas hamazon. And that's what Rav Moshe devotes the rest of his tshuva. But he writes that since, however, not everyone agrees that using egg without fruit juice is considered to be matzah ashira, therefore a person should not eat this matzah ashira after the zman of achilas chametz, just out of an additional concern that maybe it might have the status in some way of chametz because it's a retarded form of leaven, and therefore you should avoid eating it after the zman of achilas chametz. And that's why our minhag is not to consume matzah ashira after chatzos, or really after the zman of achilas, sof zman achilas chametz.
There is
Yeah.
such thing as fruit juice matzah.
I think it does exist.
Yeah, I was going to use that. You get grape juice matzah. Is it the same as egg matzah?
I've never heard of fruit juice matzah in my life. In what country?
So egg matzah is considered to be.
He quotes the Rambam, who says that you could theoretically be yotze the mitzvah of matzah, even with matzah made with mei peiros, even with matzah ashira. So it's for that reason that once we know that we can't have chametz, we also refrain from eating matzah ashira. That's
Egg,
one.
So like when Rav Moshe makes his passing about egg matzah, that means that egg matzah is something that was established, was created in the 20th century.
No, not at all.
No, it was
It's
before.
been around for ages.
Even at the time when they not that it
It's
hadn't-
not a new technology, right?
No, but how it's not you're giving here a whole divine Torah from these people who are joining or whatever is that but they don't know about egg matzah.
Sure they do.
They
Sure.
do?
That's matzah ashira. Yeah,
Well, so
that is
egg
that,
matzah goes back.
egg matzah goes back to the times of the Gemara.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
confused, because first you say it's fruit juice matzah, then you say it's egg matzah, which one is?
So Rav Moshe includes in this final paragraph that it's all under the rubric of matzah ashira,
All
whether it's with eggs or whether it's with milk or whether it's with juice. However, it has this quasi status. According to some, it may even be chametz, and according to others, you may be able to fulfill your mitzvah of matzah with it. So because of this mysterious sort of question mark, Ashkenazim bichlal do not eat matzah ashira on Pesach at all.
for older.
Right. And therefore you should refrain from eating it after the Zman of Achilas Chametz. And also because certainly eating matzah after Chatzos is going to be problematic in the case, if in fact it has a din of matzah. So according to all opinions, you have to refrain from eating matzah ashira, egg matzah, fruit juice matzah, milk matzah, whatever it is. You have to refrain from eating it, certainly from chatzos and onwards, and really lechatchila from the sov zman achilas chametz and onwards. So Rav Moshe basically advocates using matzah ashira as an option for those who are a little bit freaked out of having chametz in their house during this 3-day yontif. So that's 100% valid. And as I mentioned, between Mincha and Mariv, that's our goal. Our goal is to have an egg matzah available for the meals that if we were trying to put it together, hopefully we'll be able to accommodate the shul and to be able to serve Friday night dinner and Shabbos
So Friday night you're gonna
on egg
matzah.
matzah, yeah.
And then Shabbos morning,
Also egg matzah.
also same day. And
That's
that's not.
Should is also egg matzah.
So for Shalashudis,
Say so.
Shalashudis is a problem now. The Mishnah Brura had quoted the Vilna Gaon as saying that it's preferred to divide your morning meal into 2 parts. However, and I'll finish with this, there is a Zohar. The Zohar who says that anytime Shabbos is an Erev Yontif, it questions whether there is a mitzvah of Sudah Shlishit on that day. You may remember this from 3 years ago. That could be something there, because I did discuss this Zohar 3 years ago. So I'll just read it from the Hebrew translation, the Sulam translation. Amar Rabbi Elazar, Suda Shlishit Shel Shabbat Kishekara Bo Oreach Dahainu Yom Tov. When Shabbos has a guest, meaning that Yom Tov falls either on Shabbos or right after Shabbos, Ozvim Ota et Suda Shlishit O Ein Ozvim Ota. Do we abandon Shalashudis or not? Im ein ozvim ota el shochlim suda shlishit nimsa she'arech dahenu sudat leil yom tov nidcha mishulchan hamelech. If we don't abandon Shalashudis and we embrace Shalashudis even then, it turns out that we are in some way disrespecting the Yom Tov meal that will be Motzei Shabbos. We're pushing it off from the Shulchan HaMelech, from the table of the king. Ki machmat sudah shlishit eino yachol le'echol tehavon sudat leil Yom Tov bet. He says, because if you eat Shalashudis, you're precluding yourselves from having a robust meal, the Yom Tov that's on Motzei Shabbos. V'im ozvim ota. Right. And if we do forsake it, if we do abandon Shalashudis, dahainu she'ein ochlim sudah shlishit nimtza pigam b'suudos hamelech ki hamelech shu Shabbos chasur lo suda echas. Then we're also disgracing the other king, which is Shabbos. So we're sort of darned if we do, darned if we don't. So that's the question of the Zohar. So Amar lo Reb Shimon Aviv. So Reb Shimon Bar Yochai answered his son Reb Elazar as follows. V'doime lo melech shekar lo oreach. He says, well, let's make an analogy to a king who invites a respected guest over to his home. V'lakacha ma'achal mimenu v'natan el ha'oreach. What does the king do? He takes his own food and he gives it to the guest. That's what a hospitable host is supposed to do. Nimsa afal pisha hamelech eino ochel imo hu ochel mimachal hamelech v'hamelech noten lo le'echol. So it turns out that even though the king may not be able to eat with him because the king may not have enough food for both of them, the king would prefer that his guest has the food and he does not have the food. Afkan hashabes mevatele suuda hashlishis kedei shahareach shehu leil yom tov sheni tihiyeh suda suleteya. And therefore, that's what Shabbos does. Shabbos says, you know what? Ich bin moichel. I'm here every 7 days. Shabbos is going to be here every 7 days, no matter what. Yontiv is a special oireach. It's a special guest. I'm going to be moichel my meal, Shabbos says, shalashudis, so that I can allow my chashava oireach to have a chashava meal. And that's, therefore, the Zohar is of the opinion that there's no din of shalashudis when Shabbos is on an Erev Yontiv. Okay, so I want to be very clear about that. Now, the Kloisenberger Rebbe, in the Divrei...
The people that were still on
Are you being serious now? No. Okay.
the Zohar. You're acting like the Zohar.
Yeah, well, the Kloisenberger says that whenever there's a machlokas between Nigla and Nisser, and if you're a chussid, you paskin like the Zohar. Yeah, okay. What do you wear tefillin on Chol Hamoed?
No.
Okay. Anyway, his conclusion, because we're
He came to Shabbat to the Erev in the That's what the Zohar says. I think he was talking about when Yom Tov is on Shabbos, as opposed to.
okay, sorry. So
Erev or Yom Tov. No, just, did you say the bottom of that paragraph? Masha came to Shabbos.
Mashen Kein b'Shabbos shebe Erev Yom Tov, Ein Mevatlan Suda Shlishis Mivnei Sudas Leil Yom Tov, Ve'ein Lahakshas Ari Shimon Reb Elazar Beno Hayu Be'eretz Yisrael Shein Sham Beis Yom Tovim, Ki Yishlomer Sham Meduber Hu Beveis Yomim Shel Rosh Hashanah Hanoig B'Gam Be'eretz Yisrael O Shalom Klapi B'nei Chutz La'aretz V'Beis Rav Hamnuna Saba Lo Chashu L'Reach B'Shazu Ela Sha'achlu Suda Shlishis V'Achrach B'Lo Yom Tov Sheni Hayu Misradrim Hasuda La'Oreach. Okay, you're right. According to this Zohar, it only applies when the Shabbos is the first day of a 2-day Yom Tov. Okay, you're absolutely right. However, that notwithstanding, the minhag of the Tzanzerov, Shelo Achal, Suda Shlishit B'chol Erev Yom Tov Rishon O Achron Shechal B'Shabbos, V'hu Al Pi Divrei HaZohar. So he says, he expands on it. And he basically comes to the conclusion from if Os Yud Gimel, Mikol Holein Yatzalon Yisod Gadol Bahalacha L'das HaZohar. Zohar. Magam Diyesh Bazech Shash Bracha Shein Etzricha L'das HaTois V'Svisiatam. He says you have two issues. Number one, the Zohar considers Yom Tov your Oreach, and number two, you have this concern of a bracha Shein Etzricha, like the Mishnah Berurah was careful to point out. Va'afladas harosh tekivin sha'osa l'chvod suda Shabbos shaper damir l'ropa poskim lo yatsi yedei chavas suda shlishis kodem avavu mechza v'inkan mitzvah suda Shabbos. Plus, you have the concern that having the meal before chatzos is not even shalosh shudas bichlal. The ikein bazeh shabanu lachush v'latzeis ladas hayareim hayuchumer da'asi lidei kula b'bracha she'etzrich no me'ah el yaraba. Bigam yeshlachosh tamachmash adam bahul ligmar sudas or kodem zman isra lo yisha bein hasudos. We're concerned because the person is in such a rush, he's not going to have the proper frame of mind to pause sufficiently between the first and second meal. Umikeven shekol ikar suda Shabbos of poskim in the Rabbanan. He says, since the Shalashudis is only a mitzvah de Rabbanan, Valkopanim laharbos deos yotze mein atar beperos b'mini targima, and even if you're going to argue that it's midoraisa, you can certainly be yotze your deoraisa with things other than bread. So he says, and let's see, Okay, because of all of these reasons, he says, Al kain svir le'lazar de'in lasos suda shlishis u'mikol hani tamim michui azar shelo lechol suda shlishis v'yadu shebechol makom. Okay, and therefore on that basis, he comes to the conclusion that you should not eat shalashudas when Yom Tov is going to be on Motzei Shabbos. So even though you're right, Harry, it's a good point that you pointed out. Nonetheless, even the Tzanzer extended it to any time Erev Yom Tov fell out on Shabbos. Yeah, yeah.
Because of that. Because of the rush.
Correct.
I see sure that you should, that don't do Shabbos. No?
Yeah, that's what those
They always do.
So,
They should-
yeah. So first of all, we don't serve shalashudas during the entire
right.
Pesach. During the entire Pesach, we don't serve shalashudas.
But on
Except-
Shabbos, like.
Yeah.
This question.
Right. Sukkos also, we practiced according to the Divrei Yatziv. Whenever Shabbos coincided with Erev Yom Tov, we did not serve shalashudas. Yeah. So I just want to make a point of telling you that ever since I learned this Divrei Yatziv, especially as I find myself as I get older, I'm much more sensitive to consuming food and feeling full, right? As we get older, we have less tolerance for eating with a hearty appetite once we've already eaten. So therefore, I hold of this Divrei Yatziv, even though it's not like the Mishnah Berurah and not like the Vilna Gaon. It's one of those few instances where I personally find myself resonating more with the Kloisenberger than with the Gra. So this is where we'll hold it for tonight.